He thought he was invisible. He thought he was in control. For 10 years, he slipped secrets out of embassies, held dead drops in city parks, and passed microfilm beneath the noses of American officials. He thought no one was watching, but the CIA watched everything, every meeting, every signal, every lie, and they never said a word, because letting him run free wasn't a failure, it was the plan. This is the story of a spy who never realized he was the one being played. Washington, D.C., 1971. A mid-level Soviet diplomat, Viktor Mirov, arrives at the Soviet embassy under official diplomatic cover. What no one in Moscow knew was that by 1972, CIA analysts had already flagged him as a probable KGB illegal. But instead of arresting him, the CIA made a fateful decision. They would watch for 10 years. This is the story of the longest passive surveillance operation of the Cold War, and the spy who never saw it coming. From the moment Viktor Mirov arrived in Washington in the spring of 1971, he seemed every bit the polished diplomat the Soviet Union wanted the world to see. Sophisticated but accessible, warm in social settings, impeccably dressed, and fluent in English with just enough accent to seem exotic without arousing suspicion. As the newly appointed cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy, his official duties included arranging exhibits, hosting receptions, and fostering cross-cultural understanding through music, theater, and literature, all while gently pushing Soviet soft power in the heart of the American capital. He quickly became a fixture in elite social circles, rubbing shoulders with art curators, academics, and State Department staffers at gala events and embassy dinners where vintage vodka flowed as freely as polite political conversation. But behind Mirov's diplomatic grin and encyclopedic knowledge of Pushkin poetry was a man trained in some of the darkest arts of Cold War espionage, a KGB officer operating under legal cover, tasked not only with recruiting American assets, but also with assessing vulnerabilities in U.S. institutions. What Viktor didn't know was that within a year of his arrival, he had already landed on a CIA watch list, not because of one dramatic misstep, but due to a slow accumulation of what Langley analysts called behavioral static, unexplained changes to routine, inconsistencies in his cover story, and communication patterns intercepted through NSA surveillance of embassy lines. His routine walks through DuPont Circle that veered slightly off course, his tendency to linger too long at certain payphones, the brief but regular meetings with visiting Soviet businessmen who arrived without fanfare and left within 48 hours. Each by itself was unremarkable, deniable, explainable. But together, they formed a pattern, a rhythm out of sync with typical diplomatic activity. Yet instead of arresting or expelling him, as they'd done with other agents once exposed, the CIA chose a different path, to let him run. It was a calculated risk, one that made some in the agency uneasy, but the benefits were too great to ignore. By allowing Mirov to operate freely under the illusion of safety, they could observe the MIVIDs, contacts, and information channels he relied on. Every brush pass, every coded message, every dinner guest at his embassy apartment became a thread in a wider web the CIA was methodically mapping. Surveillance teams followed discreetly, rotating agents weekly to avoid pattern detection. Counterintelligence officers studied his habits, built psychological profiles, even recruited sources inside his social circle who reported back innocuous details that added up over time. What kind of wine he preferred, what time he typically left for the embassy, who he avoided speaking to at parties. The CIA wasn't just watching Mirov, they were learning him. And as his confidence grew, as his network quietly expanded under his careful hand, Mirov never once suspected that his greatest vulnerability wasn't a rival agent or a missed signal, but the quiet eyes tracking him from the shadows, collecting every move like evidence in a case that wouldn't close for a decade. In early 1972, Operation Pinhole officially began with a single directive from CIA counterintelligence chief James Gardner: don't touch the spider, just map the web. From that moment forward, Viktor Mirov's life was no longer private, though he remained blissfully unaware. The CIA had bugged his embassy apartment in Georgetown using a high-frequency transmitter concealed behind a wall socket that appeared untouched since construction. Even the ashtray on his desk had been swapped with an identical model containing a passive resonator. Every cough, every whispered Russian phrase, Every groaning floorboard under his shoes was captured and fed to a rotating team of linguists and cryptographers stationed in a secure listening post 5 blocks away. Surveillance units operated in staggered 12-hour shifts, their faces never repeated, their presence masked by delivery uniforms, construction vests, or elderly joggers with improbable stamina. Each tail was trained in urban shadowing techniques, never too close, never too far, using reflections in windows, gaps in traffic, even children's playgrounds as cover points. Mirov's mail was covertly copied by a task force embedded in the State Department's diplomatic pouch division. The FBI, looped in under the guise of interagency cooperation, provided license plate tracking and financial monitoring of Mirov's associates. One by one, his casual friendships were reclassified as surveillance targets. The painter from New York he met at a gallery opening, a KGB courier, the bookstore clerk who slipped him a matchbook with a star inked on its cover, a go-between for intercepted intelligence. The CIA never interfered directly, instead letting each exchange unfold naturally, each dead drop in a newspaper vending machine, each coded chalk mark on the underside of a park bench. Every time Mirov believed he was executing a flawless pass, an invisible observer was nearby, logging the moment down to the second. Analysts at Langley constructed a comprehensive behavioral model of Mirov, tracking how often he used his left hand to gesture when lying, how long he paused before answering politically sensitive questions, even how often he looked at specific landmarks before entering an exchange. Nothing was left to chance. The agency built a room, an exact replica of Mirov's apartment, to rehearse surveillance angles and acoustic anomalies. Operation Pinhole became a masterclass in strategic patience. By mid-1973, they had mapped 43 confirmed contacts, decrypted 17 of Mirov's cipher patterns, and identified 5 compromised American citizens, all without tipping their hand. What the CIA found most useful, however, wasn't what Mirov gave away, it was what he didn't know. He didn't know the CIA had cracked the KGB's local radio frequencies. He didn't know his favorite lunch spot had been selected for its acoustics, allowing parabolic mics to capture conversations through a window pane. He didn't know his handler in New York had been flipped 6 months earlier and was feeding him doctored documents. Mirov thought he was conducting a secret war in the shadows, unaware that every move was a performance on a stage meticulously constructed for an audience of unseen enemies who had no intention of cutting the show short, at least not yet. By the spring of 1974, Operation Pinhole had entered its most valuable phase, as Viktor Mirov's carefully cultivated efforts bore fruit in the form of 2 American assets, both seemingly forgettable cogs in the massive machinery of government contracting, yet each with access to streams of low-level technical data that, when aggregated, formed a mosaic of American defense capabilities. One was Douglas Treadwell, a systems analyst at a subcontractor linked to a Department of Energy satellite project. The other was Linda Farrow, an administrative aide with clearance to review maintenance logs from a defense communications relay hub in Northern Virginia. Both had been groomed slowly and methodically, approached not with ideology but with subtle flattery, offers of money, and an empathetic ear to their frustrations with bureaucracy and stagnant wages. Mirov didn't make direct contact. He was too careful for that. Instead, brush passes were arranged through intermediaries posing as journalists, consultants, or fellow disgruntled employees. The intelligence came in on microfilm, Polaroid photographs of printouts, and even hand-copied transcriptions folded neatly into innocuous mailings. Each package would vanish into one of Mirov's dead drops and, days later, reappear in diplomatic pouches bound for Moscow. But the CIA, watching everything, allowed it all to flow. They wanted to trace the route, see which data the KGB deemed important, how long it took to travel from the source to Soviet hands, and whether anything changed along the way. The agency's confidence wasn't arrogance, it was strategy. Langley had already bugged the copy room at Treadwell's office and installed a magnetic tap on the Xerox machine Farrow used daily. As the documents moved, CIA teams shadowed their journey, building timelines, intercepting pouches, and in some cases even replacing the contents with altered versions, maps with mislabeled coordinates, engineering diagrams with slight but critical errors. The goal wasn't just to monitor, it was to mislead. By 1975, the intelligence community began noticing shifts in Soviet procurement and development patterns that suggested Moscow was acting on the tainted data. Submarine components ordered that didn't fit, communication systems that failed field testing. It was working. Meanwhile, CIA counterintelligence used the unfolding network to widen its scope. Treadwell led them to an accountant handling off-the-books payments. Farrow's nervous phone calls brought to light a courier operating between D.C. and Chicago. One by one, the branches of Mirov's tree were mapped, watched, and either co-opted or quietly dismantled. 6 confirmed moles, Americans working against their country, were either flipped into double agents or deliberately fed a steady stream of sanitized or sabotaged intelligence. Not a single arrest was made. There were no news stories, no scandals, just shadows shifting silently behind desks and around corners. And Mirov, increasingly emboldened by his apparent success, began to expand his operations, believing his instincts had elevated him to a level of operational mastery. What he didn't see, what he never even considered, was that he wasn't guiding the game. He was inside it, a pawn moving square by square across a board he had already built, playing against an opponent who never needed to cheat because they wrote the rules. By late 1975, the tension inside Langley was no longer confined to the wiretap reports and surveillance logs. It was spreading across the briefing rooms and echoing through the secure corridors where America's most seasoned counterintelligence minds discerned to debate a question that had no easy answer. How long is too long to let a traitor run? Viktor Mirov had become a ghost in the machine, a man the agency knew intimately, tracked obsessively, and yet refused to touch. For some agents, especially younger operatives who had come up through the field and still bore the scars of blown covers and compromised sources, it was maddening. They had enough evidence to arrest Mirov 3 times over: documented dead drops, photographic surveillance, intercepted communications, a full behavioral profile. In any other case, he'd be in cuffs before the ink on the report dried. But this wasn't just about Mirov. It was about the network, what he knew, what he thought he knew, and what Moscow thought he knew. And the man who made the final call, Langley's Eastern Bloc Division Chief Walter O'Hara, was a veteran of Cold War deception who had watched agents come and go like leaves on a seasonal wind. O'Hara stood at the center of it all, chain-smoking through back-to-back meetings, insisting that they weren't playing whack-a-mole with Soviet spies. "This isn't checkers, it's chess," he said more than once, his voice dry from too much bourbon and too little rest. "If we arrest him now, we close the door. But if we let him walk, we open a dozen others." He argued that Mirov was the perfect conduit through which they could poison the well, corrupt the Soviets' data stream, mislead their analysts, and turn their operational trust against itself. He reminded his team that Soviet intelligence worked in compartments. If they could make Mirov's reports look accurate while subtly twisting the truth, they could trigger bad decisions at the highest levels of the KGB, decisions based on altered maps, flawed specs, and overconfidence built on lies. But not everyone was convinced. A faction of CIA analysts pushed for a different course, warning that the longer Mirov remained operational, the greater the chance he might stumble onto a target they couldn't afford to lose. Missile deployments, counter-espionage strategies, something real. "You don't leave a rattlesnake in your tent just to see where it slithers," one said during a tense interagency meeting. But O'Hara didn't blink. He had the backing of the director, and more importantly, he had results. Soviet missteps that could be traced directly back to Mirov's feeds. Submarine designs based on altered schematics. Communications blackouts caused by mismatched encryption protocols. Even a diplomatic scandal that unraveled after doctored embassy transcripts reached Moscow. To O'Hara, this wasn't delay, it was strategy. A game of inches played in silence, where patience was a weapon and timing was everything. "You don't arrest the fisherman," he said one night as he stared at a photo of Mirov crossing a street in Foggy Bottom. "You watch what he's reeling in." And so the game continued, unseen, unbroken, and deeper than Mirov ever imagined. In the summer of 1976, Viktor Mirov felt the first crack of doubt creep into his otherwise unshakable confidence. A quiet tremor in the rhythm of his well-practiced routine, a car, slate gray and unremarkable, appeared in his peripheral vision too many times in too many places over the course of 3 days. Parked a block from the embassy on Monday, 2 cars behind him on Massachusetts Avenue Tuesday, and idling by a newsstand near his favorite lunch spot on Wednesday. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but Mirov was trained to notice, so he tested it. On Thursday, he exited the embassy through a side entrance he rarely used, changed his walking pattern, doubled back twice on foot, then abruptly entered a barber shop he had no appointment at. There it was again, the same Ford LTD, gliding past the shop a minute later, then disappearing down the street. That night, he sat in his apartment with a tumbler of vodka in one hand and a pencil in the other, sketching a crude map of sightings on hotel stationery, lines crisscrossing D.C. like a spider web drawn in doubt. The next day, he shifted to more aggressive counter-surveillance tactics, random turns, unsignaled lane changes, stopping abruptly at green lights. And though the tail was invisible by design, his instincts were screaming. He knew something was off. And yet, the CIA, having anticipated that even Mirov might one day look over his shoulder, executed their contingency plan with surgical precision. On Saturday evening, as Mirov walked through a poorly lit section of Constitution Avenue after a staged cultural outreach dinner with a minor Soviet trade delegate, two men, contracted locals in plain clothes, emerged from an alley and shoved him against a wall. It was fast, messy, and chaotic. One pinned his arm, the other tore the briefcase from his grasp, and then both vanished as quickly as they came, fading into the darkness like ghosts in the fog. Within seconds, a witness just passing by, an undercover CIA asset, rushed to Mirov's side, playing the role of concerned Good Samaritan to perfection. He helped him to his feet, cursed the damn crime in this city, and disappeared into the night. Mirov, shaken but uninjured, reported the incident to his embassy security detail, who relayed it to Moscow with his attached suspicions. His tone was cautious but insistent. Someone was watching. He detailed the car, the strange timing, the mugging that felt just a little too convenient. But the response from KGB Center was curt and dismissive. Americans have high street crime. Embassy staff are not under active surveillance. Remain cautious, but continue operations as scheduled. That was the message. And just like that, Mirov's concern was folded back into silence. Moscow had no time for ghosts. They didn't believe their man was being watched, and Mirov, conditioned to trust orders above instinct, forced himself to let it go. He never saw the mugging again as anything but a random assault. He never again noticed the gray Ford, but the watchers remained, just outside his vision, just beyond his certainty, and closer than ever before. By early 1978, Operation Pinhole had evolved from an observation campaign into a full-spectrum psychological operation, and its crown jewel came in the form of a quiet betrayal so precise, so damaging, that the Soviet Union would spend years unknowingly acting on poisoned intelligence, all delivered through the hands of their own trusted man. The tipping point came with the defection, not public, not loud, of Airman First Class Raymond Rourke, a technician assigned to a communications analysis cell at Andrews Air Force Base. Rourke wasn't caught with a briefcase of documents. He walked into a controlled CIA approach after becoming disillusioned with both his stagnant military career and his financial future, and when handlers realized he was the very same source that Mirov had been cultivating for months, Langley seized the opportunity like a hunter finding his quarry asleep. From that point forward, every document Mirov received from Rourke passed through CIA hands first, scanned, studied, edited, and in some cases completely rewritten. The agency didn't just intercept intelligence, they became the authors of a new, fictional reality. Charts of satellite launch schedules were tweaked to show launches that never happened. Signal encryption data was subtly altered to create patterns the Soviets would chase in vain. Defense infrastructure diagrams were 6 months outdated, sometimes more. And Mirov, unwitting and methodical, delivered every word, every pixel, every deception straight to Moscow. It was a masterstroke of strategic misdirection. Soviet analysts, trusting the source without question due to Mirov's impeccable track record, began shifting resources based on false assumptions. A missile calibration team was dispatched to correct a non-existent flaw. Electronic warfare protocols were updated to defend against systems that didn't exist. Money, time, manpower, all burned in service of lies. And while Mirov basked in his perceived success, while he wrote glowing reports to his KGB contacts about how deeply embedded he had become, the CIA monitored the cascading effects of their handiwork. Each response from Moscow was dissected, revealing new priorities, new fears, and blind spots the agency didn't even know the Soviets had. Rourke's intel allowed the CIA to craft a counterfeit feedback loop, a mirror world of misinformation built on real leaks, bent just enough to guide the enemy without alerting them to the manipulation. To Mirov, it was a golden age of productivity. His value had never seemed higher, his confidence never more unshakable. But to Langley, he was no longer a spy. They had turned him into a delivery system, a walking conduit for engineered falsehoods, and he didn't even realize the war he thought he was winning had become a controlled experiment in deception. That year, an internal CIA memo circulated with the headline, "Mirov's line has gone hotter than the sun," but the heat wasn't in the content, it was in the control. For the first time, the United States wasn't just reacting to Soviet espionage, they were shaping it, and the man who enabled it still believed he was the one doing the shaping. By 1980, the tide within the KGB's upper ranks began to shift from pride to paranoia, though no one dared call it that openly, not in Lubyanka, not in coded reports, and certainly not in messages sent to Washington. The problem was subtle, almost imperceptible. The Americans were beginning to behave oddly. Satellite trajectories expected to align with recent intelligence weren't matching up. Defense communication protocols previously observed under surveillance suddenly changed without warning or explanation. Worse still, Soviet predictions about U.S. missile developments, predictions based on data passed up through trusted field sources, began to falter. There were no public failures, no international embarrassments, but the undercurrent of misalignment was growing. In Langley, this was by design. Mirov's channel had become the CIA's most effective Trojan horse, and analysts carefully calibrated the disinformation pipeline, introducing just enough error to mislead, but never enough to alarm. But in Moscow, unease was mounting. A quiet review of Mirov's entire operational history was ordered by Directorate S, though not under his name, an internal audit masked as a routine field performance assessment. His case file was dissected, timelines reconstructed, source identities cross-verified. The conclusion? Mirov was flawless, too flawless. The metrics showed high-value intelligence delivered regularly, well-documented drop protocols, no unexplained gaps, no contact anomalies, no counterintelligence red flags. Still, some voices inside the center raised concerns. Could it be a deception operation? Was it possible the Americans were playing the long game? These whispers, however, were swiftly overruled by others who had grown invested in Mirov's success, both politically and professionally. His value was undeniable on paper. Pulling him out without proof would be seen as weakness, or worse, paranoia unbecoming of a seasoned intelligence agency. Ironically, the CIA had engineered this exact outcome. By preserving Mirov's credibility, avoiding high-value intelligence that would provoke scrutiny, ensuring he passed both genuine and doctored material, even staging staged dead drops that yielded precisely what Moscow expected. They had safeguarded him against his own side's suspicion. His KGB performance reports, signed and stamped with the confidence of men who had never seen the edges of the illusion, painted the portrait of a disciplined, effective, and loyal officer. And Mirov, flattered by commendations and reassured by Moscow's continued reliance on his work, sank deeper into complacency. He walked the streets of Washington with his usual calm, submitted his routine cipher reports without hesitation, and spoke in coded telephone conversations with the measured cadence of a man fully in control. But every move was recorded, every phrase transcribed, and every success he believed he'd achieved was carefully orchestrated by men sitting behind glass walls, sipping coffee in soundproof rooms, watching a performance he never knew he was giving. In Moscow, the suspicion would never solidify, not because it wasn't there, but because the CIA had so effectively written Mirov's story that even his skeptics couldn't find a chapter out of place. On a brisk Thursday in February 1981, Viktor Mirov sat at his usual corner table at the Café Russe on K Street, sipping coffee laced with melancholy and purpose, oblivious that he was moments away from orchestrating his own fall. A week earlier, he had received a prearranged signal, a subtle alteration in a phrase whispered to him by a known contact outside the Bulgarian embassy, a man he believed was a fringe source in the Pentagon's logistics department. In truth, the contact had been flipped by the CIA months ago, and was now an instrument of Operation Pinhole's endgame. The signal, decoded in Mirov's mind as a directive from Moscow, instructed him to initiate a fresh dead drop sequence to collect urgent intelligence. He complied without hesitation. He had done this dozens of times over the last decade, each time believing himself to be a ghost, slipping between the cracks of an enemy nation. What he didn't know was that the CIA, now armed with 10 years of operational data, surveillance tapes, cryptographic keys, and a complete list of every contact Mirov had ever cultivated, had constructed this final exchange down to the second. Surveillance teams had been pre-positioned 3 days in advance, embedded in every possible vantage point. Inside parked vans disguised as delivery trucks, inside the third-floor window of a dentist's office across from the drop site, even posing as joggers and dog walkers loitering in the park where the dead drop would occur. Mirov, methodical as ever, followed protocol. He scanned for tails, circled a block twice, and approached the rusted maintenance shed in the northeast corner of Roosevelt Park. Inside his overcoat pocket, a small manila envelope held what he believed were microphotographs of newly acquired submarine telemetry data. In reality, they were CIA fabrications, carefully doctored images containing markers the agency would use to verify when and where the Soviets processed the material. He placed the envelope behind the loose panel under the shed's foundation and marked a nearby lamppost with a piece of chalk, the signal that the drop was ready. As he turned to leave, casually lighting a cigarette, a woman with a stroller passed by, nodding politely. She was one of 4 CIA field agents with direct line of sight on the drop, already relaying his every move via concealed radio. Mirov walked away, unaware that 2 agents had followed him since he exited his apartment that morning, and that his apartment itself had been swept and copied the night before while he was out. The trap had been sprung not to catch him in the act. Langley already had enough evidence to bury him, but to document the final note of a decade-long performance. The CIA didn't want just a conviction. They wanted closure. They wanted to watch the final drop, trace it to Moscow, and confirm once and for all how deep the lie had gone. And Mirov, proud and unaware, had just played his final move. On the cool morning of March 3, 1981, Viktor Mirov walked through Arlington's Fort C.F. Smith Park with the deliberate ease of a man who believed the city around him was predictable, even boring, its rhythm dictated by the dull choreography of bureaucrats and diplomats. Dressed in his familiar charcoal overcoat and flat cap, he moved with the confidence of 10 years' experience in evasion and disguise, a man who had perfected the art of blending in. In his coat pocket rested the final message he would ever attempt to pass to Moscow, a single hollowed-out U.S. quarter, its inner cavity meticulously machined to conceal a microdot containing encrypted data, believed by Mirov to be the latest update on American electronic warfare systems. It had been passed to him, as always, through what he thought was a secure channel, a contact he believed was still under his control. The CIA had, in truth, orchestrated the entire scenario, feeding him exactly what they wanted Moscow to see. As Mirov neared a weathered bench near the edge of the walking trail, he paused to light a cigarette, scanning the area with mechanical casualness. The park was quiet, sparsely populated with early joggers, a couple of birdwatchers, and a man pretending to read a newspaper, all CIA agents. He sat briefly, placing the coin beneath the bench using a practiced sleight of hand, then stood and began to walk away, unaware that he had just crossed a line that had been drawn for him years earlier. At 9:46 a.m., precisely 17 seconds after the drop, 2 agents approached him from different angles. "Excuse me, sir," one said. Mirov turned, puzzled. The second agent displayed a diplomatic identification badge, not American, not official, just enough to make Mirov hesitate. It was all they needed. Within moments, he was escorted calmly, without cuffs, to an unmarked vehicle. No one in the park even noticed. The arrest was quiet, efficient, and entirely unceremonious, just the way Langley had planned it. There would be no press, no charges filed in court. Instead, after 48 hours of intense debriefing, interrogation, and secure interviews conducted inside a classified holding facility outside D.C., the U.S. State Department issued a formal statement to the Soviet embassy, declaring Viktor Mirov persona non grata due to unspecified violations of diplomatic conduct. Within 72 hours, he was on a plane back to Moscow, disgraced but not arrested. To his colleagues, he was a political casualty of Cold War maneuvering. To the KGB, he had simply run out of favor. No one on his side ever learned that he had been compromised for nearly a decade. No one in Moscow ever knew that the intelligence he had so proudly funneled to them had been poisoned from the start. And Mirov himself, sitting in silence during the long flight home, never realized that his downfall had not been the result of a mistake, but the final move in a game he never understood was being played. After his unceremonious return to Moscow in the spring of 1981, Viktor Mirov was quietly reassigned to a mid-level desk job in the Ministry of Foreign Trade, a bureaucratic cul-de-sac for operatives who had outlived their usefulness, or, worse, become suspect liabilities too inconvenient to confront publicly. No charges were brought, no tribunals convened. Officially, there was no record of failure. But in a system where silence was more damning than accusation, the message was clear. Mirov's star had dimmed, permanently. His phone stopped ringing. Old comrades averted their eyes when passing in the hall. Invitations to party functions, once routine, ceased entirely. His wife, Anya, never asked for details about his recall, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of exhaustion, and their apartment on the outskirts of Moscow became a quiet island where days passed in rituals of avoidance. For 16 years, Mirov faded into the wallpaper of Soviet and post-Soviet life, keeping a low profile as the empire around him unraveled. He never knew the extent of what had been done to him. He never learned that nearly a dozen Soviet assets had been flipped or neutralized because of the disinformation he delivered. He never discovered that entire sections of the KGB's technical analysis wing had been paralyzed by ghost data fed directly through his hands. He didn't know that naval procurement decisions, military doctrine shifts, and key diplomatic initiatives had all been distorted by the poisoned intelligence he carried so dutifully across the Potomac. All he knew was that something had gone wrong, something invisible and silent, like a tripwire buried beneath years of certainty, and that whatever trust had once existed between himself and the center had withered into unspoken doubt. In Langley, Mirov's case became the stuff of whispered lectures and restricted memos, referenced in black binder briefings under code names like Operation Pinhole and Shadow Veil. New recruits studied him not for his mistakes, he had made so few, but for the flaw in the system that allowed him to be used as a weapon against his own side. Analysts called it the perfect silent kill. No arrests, no public exposures, no dead agents in alleys, just a slow, methodical rot introduced into the Soviet machine, allowed to spread unchecked for a decade, all while the host remained unaware. And in the intelligence community, that was the highest possible art. In April '97, Mirov died of heart failure at the age of 65, alone in a narrow hospital room that smelled of iodine and cigarette smoke. There was no obituary, no mention of his service, no medals on display. His funeral was attended by 5 people, none of them from the old days. He was buried in a modest cemetery on the edge of the city, a few kilometers from where he had once reported for KGB briefings that shaped global strategy. His grave marker simply read, V. Mirov, 1932-1997. He had spent his life believing he had outwitted the West, but in the end, the truth was crueler and far more elegant. They had watched him every step of the way, and he had never once seen them. If you found Viktor Mirov's story as haunting and fascinating as we did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon so you never miss another Cold War secret brought back to light. Let us know in the comments, was Mirov a villain, a victim, or something in between?